January 17th, 1950, Boston. A cold, ordinary night on the surface, but beneath it, history was quietly preparing to be rewritten. 11 men, bound by greed, precision, and a shared dream of impossible wealth, were about to pull off what newspapers would soon call the crime of the century. In less than 35 minutes, they would vanish into the night with what would amount to over $30 million in today's money. A haul so large, so perfectly executed, it stunned the entire nation. This is the story of the Great Brinks Robbery, a heist so bold and calculated that it inspired Hollywood's Ocean's 11, a flawless operation that would crumble to dust, all because of one man's betrayal. Back in the late 1940s, there was a certain building on Prince Street in Boston, one not celebrated for its beauty or architecture, but for what it guarded. This was the Fortress of Brinks Incorporated, a private security and armored transport company that handled millions in cash, checks, and securities for banks across New England. The Brinks building wasn't just secure, it was legendary. It was the kind of place no sane criminal would ever dare to challenge. But someone did dare. One man saw more than just money. He saw a puzzle begging to be solved. And soon that thought, that dangerous spark of possibility, would grow into the most daring robbery the United States had ever seen. Anthony Pino, a small-time crook from Boston's North End, best known for pickpocketing and petty scores, first let the idea of hitting Brinks creep into his mind. By 1947, after months of watching, asking questions, and quietly collecting fragments of information about the fortress on Prince Street, he realized the truth. This job was bigger than him. He would need a crew, and not just any crew. So Pino turned to Joseph McGinnis, a name that carried weight in Boston's underworld, a man with contacts, clout, and an instinct for who could be trusted when the stakes were life or prison. They began to assemble the pieces. They recruited Muscle, Joseph Specs O'Keefe, and Stanley Gushura, two hardened enforcers whose presence alone could shut down resistance. Vincent Costa, Pino's brother-in-law, took up the quiet but crucial role of lookout. John Banfield, a reliable hand from McGinnis's circle, would be the man behind the wheel when it was time to run. They added James Ignatius Feardy, a seasoned armed robber whose experience with stick-ups made him valuable when things went sideways. Then came Adolph Maffei, Michael Vincent Keegan, Thomas Francis Richardson, and Henry Baker, men chosen for specific skills, nerves, and loyalty. 11 men in all, each with a reason to risk everything for a single enormous payoff. With the team in place, Pino faced the next challenge, turning their raw ambition into a plan that could outwit a fortress. He understood this wouldn't be a rush job. It could take months, and he had the patience to let it so. If the score was to succeed, it had to be flawless, a fast, surgical strike that left nothing behind. That meant every move had to be choreographed, from stakeouts to alibis, with an almost obsessive attention to detail. The weeks before the heist blurred into a rhythm of reconnaissance and rehearsal. Pino watched everything. Guard rotations, when lights in the building blinked on and off, even the small habits the employees took for granted. The biggest obstacle was simple and brutal. The cash vault sat on the second floor, behind 5 locked doors. Pino's answer was methodical, almost surgical. Working after hours, the crew slipped in and stole one locked cylinder at a time. Back at their workshop, they used the cylinders to make duplicate keys, then returned the originals, so the break-in would leave no obvious trace. They also secured a green 1949 Ford stake-body truck to serve as the getaway vehicle, and spent November and December drilling their escape route until every turn and stop felt automatic.
Their disguises were part of the plan's psychology. Navy pea coats, gloves, chauffeur caps, and rubber Halloween masks that erased any trace of identity. Every small detail was practiced until it became second nature. They tested the plan again and again, creeping close enough to taste success before always pulling back. At last, on January 17, 1950, they decided the moment had come. The 11 men gathered in Roxbury, piled into the green truck, and drove toward the Brinks depot with cold, practiced calm. Once inside, the crew moved like a single, efficient machine. They forced employees to the floor, bound their hands, and muffled their cries. In a furious, perfectly timed sweep, barely 35 minutes, they emptied the vault, stuffing sacks with roughly $1.5 million in cash. Then, they melted into the night, following the escape route they'd rehearsed until it was instinct. Vincent Costa peeled off in a stolen sedan. Geoghegan put the pieces in place to support his alibi. Pino and Fierti vanished to establish theirs, while Banfield quietly disposed of the truck so no obvious trail remained. For a moment, it seemed they had pulled off the perfect crime. They also knew the legal clocks ticking against them. 3 years under federal law, 6 under state law. If they could simply wait out that 6-year window, the money might be untouchable and their names safe from prosecution. But time was not on their side. Almost immediately after the raid, sirens screamed through the city. Police and FBI agents swarmed the Brinks building, only to be met by an eerie, unnerving silence. The shaken employees couldn't give the police much to work with. All they could say was that the robbers had moved like professionals, calm, precise, almost mechanical in their coordination. They spoke barely a word, leaving behind nothing but a rubber mask, some tape, and a single hat. Still, one small detail gave investigators hope. An employee remembered seeing 4 guns, and one of them came with a traceable serial number. It wasn't much, but it was a start. 2 weeks later, a group of boys playing near the Mystic River stumbled upon one of the stolen guns, rusted, ruined, and useless. The very next day, a police officer found another firearm, but it was in equally terrible condition. Investigators began widening their search, questioning every possible lead, including former and current Brinks employees. Brinks even put up a staggering $100,000 reward for any information that could crack the case. And slowly, whispers began to surface. One witness mentioned a green Ford truck with a canvas top parked near the depot on the day of the robbery. After weeks of digging, investigators located truck parts in a dump yard in Stoughton, Massachusetts. It was the same truck, the one used in the heist, but the discovery led them only to 2 familiar names on their radar, O'Keefe and Gusciora. When questioned, both men swore they had been out drinking in Boston around 7 p.m. With no solid evidence tying them to the scene, the police had no choice but to let them walk free. But as the summer of 1950 rolled in, cracks began to form within Pino's carefully built empire, and things were about to spiral out of control. For Pino's crew, pulling off the Brinks robbery had been the ultimate test of precision, but surviving the next 6 years without slipping up would prove far tougher. Staying invisible required discipline, and not everyone in the gang had it. 2 men in particular, O'Keefe and Gusciora, couldn't resist their old habits. Whenever they talked about going on road trips, everyone knew what it really meant: more burglaries. During one of these so-called trips in Pennsylvania, their luck finally ran out. Both men were arrested. O'Keefe received a 3-year sentence, while Gusciora was staring down 5 to 20 years behind bars. As they sat in prison, the FBI began to notice something strange. The 2 weren't writing letters to their families like most inmates did. Instead, they were corresponding with a small circle of men back in Boston, the same men who had been questioned after the Brinks heist: Pino, McGinnis, Maffei, and Baker. The letters weren't about catching up or sharing news. They were asking for money to help fund their legal defense. To the FBI, it was more than suspicious. Agents quickly reopened the case and dragged the group back in for questioning. When asked about his whereabouts on the night of the robbery, Pino claimed he'd been home until around 7 p.m. before stopping by a nearby liquor store owned by McGinnis. That story was conveniently confirmed by a Boston police officer who happened to be there. As for Maffei, he had no alibi. Baker insisted he'd been at home that evening, quietly eating dinner with his family, before heading out at 7 p.m. for what he called a 2-hour walk. a walk during which, conveniently, he claimed to have met no one at all. James Faraday, the crew's armed robbery specialist, said he'd been out drinking from 5:10 to 7:45 p.m., though no one could confirm it. John Banfield took it even further, claiming he'd been drunk since New Year's Eve. But his ex-girlfriend told investigators she'd seen him completely sober on the very night of the heist. If that sounds suspicious, it's because it was. Every suspect, it seemed, had come up with the same idea: to shift locations right around 7 p.m., the perfect way to blur their timelines during the critical window of 7:10 to 7:27 p.m. when the robbery actually went down. Meanwhile, behind bars, O'Keefe and Gusiora kept their cool. They talked to no one and revealed nothing, staying silent as the investigation swirled around them. On November 25, 1952, with the federal statute of limitations about to expire, a grand jury was convened in one last desperate attempt to crack the case. Investigators hoped that pressure, or guilt, would finally force someone to talk, but no one did. The jury had no hard evidence, no credible witnesses, and no confessions to work with. By January 1953, 3 years after the heist, the grand jury admitted defeat. For Pino's crew, it was a huge relief. But they weren't out of danger yet. The state still had 3 more years to catch them. For the Brinks crew, those 3 remaining years felt like an eternity, and one man, O'Keefe, was at the center of it all. Over the next year, he bounced in and out of jail, and each time he reached out to the same old partners, demanding money for legal fees and support. But the more he asked, the colder their responses became. What had once been brotherhood was now resentment. By March 1954, O'Keefe was a free man again, and instead of keeping a low profile, he went straight back to meeting with the others. Then, just 2 months later, he did something no one could explain. Alongside an accomplice, he kidnapped Pino's brother-in-law, Vincent Costa, holding him hostage in a hotel room. 2 days and a ransom payment later, Costa was released unharmed. When questioned by police, everyone involved swore they knew nothing. But one truth was impossible to ignore: O'Keefe had become a serious problem. On June 5, 1954, the crew decided to silence him for good. As O'Keefe sat in his car, a suspicious vehicle pulled up beside him. He ducked just in time. Bullets tore through the windshield, barely missing him. 2 days later came the second attempt. This time, he wasn't as lucky. A gunman opened fire, hitting O'Keefe in the chest. Miraculously, he survived, but he finally understood. Boston was no longer safe. If he wanted to live, he had to disappear.